Let's talk about working with data. Different programming languages have different data types. In Python, or in JavaScript, or Java, these are some common data types that are available. We have a numerical data, which means just numbers 1, 5, 6, for example, 50, 100, or you can have a float, which means you can have 1.2, 1.5. We have a string, it's a text. A boolean is just two things, true or false. Next data type we have is list or array. Different programming languages have different terminology. This data type will be called array in JavaScript, and in Python we call it list. So what is this? It's basically a collection of different data types separated by a comma, wrapped around by square brackets. Lastly, we have data structures in programming language like sets, dictionaries, stacks, queues, trees. Now these terminologies might not be really familiar to you, but don't worry, you'll get there. So next question is, what code artifact exists to work with data? We have variables, constants, and functions to work with data in your program. So let's understand what is a variable. A variable is like a container where a single data value can be stored. A variable is a kind of artifact that you can create on your own in your program. It has a name called identifier. It can store one value of a given type. A value can be changed. Value can be expression as well. So here's a diagram. It's like a box. We call it a variable. Basically, in technical language, it's just like a memory location. You create a variable, it's basically a memory location. So when you create a variable, you assign a value to it. It stores the value, which occupies a location in the memory. It has a name. We call it identifier. It will have a type of variable as well. Some programming language asks you to specifically type the type of variable you're creating. Some don't, like JavaScript and Python. A constant is like a variable, but its value cannot be changed. It's basically a memory location where you store the value, and when you try to change it, it wouldn't let you change. When you create a variable, it allocates a space that stores a value in the memory, and it gets stored in 1 and 0s. The type determines the amount of memory used to store a value. For example, if you create a variable with age, you define a type int. You create a variable weight, you define a type double. So you can see the difference between defining age and it gets this much memory, and if you define double, it gets a bit more memory in the location. Variables can be declared in the functions as well. These are called local variables. We haven't talked about function, we haven't looked at function, how we create them, but just understand that whenever you define variables within the function, they're called local variables. We talk about assignment statement. Assignment statement is used to store a value in a variable. So when you are creating a variable, you use an assignment statement. Well, assigning a value is pretty simple. Create a variable is equal to sign and an expression. Using expression to read the value of a variable or constant or from a function. Variable and constants can be read in expressions. For example, when you define an expression, you have 2 multiplied by pi multiplied by radius. A radius and pi is a variable or a constant which has some value stored into it. So when you multiply 2 with pi, it is not going to multiply that with pi, but it will use the value stored in pi. Similarly, with the radius, when you multiply pi with radius, it will multiply that with the value stored in it. So how functions are created and used? A function is like a procedure except it returns a value. So in this diagram, we have a function, we have some local variables here, and we have some parameters which going inside the function. So it's an input, can take a parameter, which we talk about what is the parameter. Then here we have output, which is the result. So this is a function. We'll take a look at how we define the functions. Expression can include function calls. So here we have sin, which basically a function. So as you can see, it calculates values in expression using a function call. Call the function passing the parameter value. So in parentheses, we define parameters for a function. Once this function takes a parameter, it processes and returns the result. Function call is like a procedure call. We define a function name followed by parentheses, which takes arguments. Variables can be declared within the function and they will be called local variables. Few key points about local variables: they exist inside the function, they can only be accessed within the function. Most variables will be local variables within the function, and they will also be destroyed when the functional call finishes. We need to talk about function parameters. Local variables are not accessible and the global variables are evil. So how is the data shared, you might be wondering? How can we share the data between functions and procedures? How can you tell a function what values to use? Can you get data back from procedure or function? So the answer to that is parameters. Parameters allows data to be passed to a function. Parameters are variables just once declared in a special place, and that special place is within the parentheses of a function. They receive a value from a caller when the function or procedure is called. So here's a diagram. You pass the data into a procedure using parameters. Parameters accept values from function, use them to make function procedure much more useful, allow data to be configured within the function. One function can create many different outputs by calling the different values. Now we understood some of the common core concept of programming. From the next video, we are going to write code. Let's get started.